Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Jackson Interaction Podcast. I'm your host, the king of all wrestling media, Gene Jackson. And we're taking a little break today from our series on comedians that we've been doing and getting back into some wrestling, which, as you can tell behind me, anybody knows me, that's my thing. So I'm really excited about today's interview. So people who know me knows that I've always been fascinated with Herb Abrams, UWF. And like everybody else, that Dark Side of the Ring episode kind of renewed that interest and got me back looking for some more info. And I come across on Facebook a while back that there was a gentleman working on a book about Herb Abrams and the UWF. And then I kind of lost track of it for a bit. And then a buddy of mine hit me up and he said, "Hey, did you ever read that book about Herb Abrams and the UWF?" And I said, "No, I missed it." And he's like, "Oh, it's great, man. You got to read it." So I got it and I started reading it, and I was about halfway through. And I remember I'm like, "Hey, I saw a page for this on Facebook." So I reached out to the author, and he was gracious enough to agree to come on the podcast and talk to us. And that's what we're going to do right now. So right now, I want to welcome the author of Tortured Ambition, the UWF Herb Abrams story, Jonathan Plombon. Am I saying that correctly?
You're saying that correctly. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, as we mentioned, I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen right now. There's a picture of the cover of the book, and I was really interested in talking to you, one, because I'm fascinated by the subject, and two, a few years back, I had took the notion that I was going to write a book about Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert because he's a very interesting figure in the history of wrestling, and somehow there's never been a book done on him. There's not, there's shooting reviews where people talked about him and this and that, and so I reached out to his parents, Tommy and Peggy Gilbert, and they were on board. And so I tried to reach out to Doug, but I couldn't ever touch base with him. So I got to work on it. Worked on it for almost 2 years. I had the majority of the book written. I had done a ton of interviews with a ton of different people, and it was coming along really well. I was really proud of it. And then all of a sudden, Doug Gilbert turns up and states that he is the executor of Eddie's estate and that he intends to write a book on Eddie one day and just shut the whole thing down. And now it's just sitting on a hard drive, you know. And then people have told me, like, hey, you could do it as an unofficial biography. You could do something with it. And I could, and I may. I've put pieces of it up online at different times. But I thought, well, if that's what his brother don't want it, we won't put it out there. I remember I talked at length with Dutch Mantell at one point, and when I first told Dutch what I was doing, Dutch is like, "You're crazy. I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole." He's like, "There's too many variations of that story," and eventually I found out what he meant. But I say all that to say, uh, how hard was it to go about taking on this project? Where did you start? Where did you begin?
Let's see. Well, I started just by gathering as much information I could off the internet. There was a fan site for UWF. There was one, and that gave me sort of a start. From there, I went and looked for the shoot interviews with various people who had been, associated with Herb Abrams. I collected all that data, and after that, I was like, well, I just have to kind of. I don't have anything really new or anything that's like hasn't been uncovered before. So that's when I knew I had to start with the interviews. And the first person that I reached out to was Sunny Beach, and all the credit to him in the world because I didn't have anything started. I didn't have any sort of publisher behind me, and he agreed to talk to me for like 2 hours and give me all this information, just out of the goodness of his heart. And from there, it just went from me trying to find as many people as I possibly could. And we were sort of discussing this before the show. There was an ex-girlfriend of Herb Abrams, whom I found, and she had been keeping all this stuff of Herb Abrams in her closet for well, like 20 years, I think, at that point, or something like that.
Yeah.
And she was like, "Well, I kind of want to just get rid of all this stuff." She's remarried and everything. She just kind of wants to move on from that. Doesn't want to have anything holding it back. And she just sent me all this stuff, and that was really what I got. I mean, that was really the start of the really big, deep information that wasn't anywhere, because like some of that stuff, like the Pacific Rim tour that I talked about in the book. I would have never found that if it wouldn't have been for um, all these documents and everything that she had. So I think I was pretty lucky, because it wasn't as bad of a start as it could have been. And things, I mean, it never went smoothly, but I think it still went well, even though it was sort of a rocky road to, getting the book done.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying before we went on the air. Like you managed to find a lot of interesting information that wasn't out there previously, and that hasn't made it into like the dark side of the ring and different things like that. Um, and I only reference the Eddie Gilbert book thing just kind of as a kind of a context of me kind of getting where you're coming from, because I found it was surprising that as I reached out to people and told them like, hey, I'm starting this book on Eddie Gilbert, people were a lot more open than I thought they would be to cooperating and, like I say, providing information, sending me. Oh my gosh, I had tons of pictures and different things. So were people in general pretty on board to talk about their experiences with Herb, and was most of it spoke about fondly? Was there anybody who was still kind of holding grudges, or how was everybody's kind of temperature, I guess, so to speak, towards Herb Abrams?
Um, I think. I mean, I guess it was. I mean, there were a couple people who sort of were not on board, even at the very beginning, and that was kind of scary because you at that time I didn't know how many people I was going to find or how many people were going to talk to me. So when you had a couple of people who not only uh, declined for an interview, but just flat out just didn't want me to make it or write it, that was that was a little bit that I mean, like I said before, that frightened me a bit because I didn't know how much more I was going to be able to get. But I just sort of persevered on, even though there were like a couple people, and to this day, I guess there are a couple people who just didn't want me to write the book. I don't know what they thought I was going to write in it, but
Yeah.
I know one. I know I was going to be accused of like writing or making up the entire book, and I remember thinking like, if I'm going to write the entire book just from my imagination, I'm going to a lot of trouble talking to all these people for no good reason. So
Right.
that's why I kind of wanted to express these people. But yeah, there is always as for giving up information, there were people who were very forthcoming, and then there were people who told me right out that there was stuff that they weren't going to talk about. So there's with everything that I have in the book, I'm betting a lot of stories out there about Herb Abrams and more stuff out there than I was able to find. So it's one of those things where I had to take what I could get, and I think I got a lot of the good stuff. And if that other information never comes out, I still think I did a pretty good job researching and getting everything
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, while the facts are the facts, I mean, a lot of the stories just are what they are.
done. Mm-hmm.
I still don't think that you painted him in a negative light, or I mean, I think personally, seeing his story from beginning to end gave you a little bit of insight into what his intentions were, or what
Mm-hmm.
his perceived intentions were, and a little more insight into kind of how things went the way they did, and how we got there. And I mean, I don't know, for people who may have not wanted you to write it to protect his image or whatever, to me, the book provided a lot more insight and context of things and kind of changed my opinion of him than just the sensationalization of like, because there's only so much you can fit into 40 minutes of a Dark Side of the Ring episode.
Yep.
And in the end, you're really, I mean, you just came away with it going like, man, that dude's a whoremongering cokehead, that liked wrestling apparently and wore crazy boots.
Yeah.
And so if and I'm sure that hadn't happened by when you started this whole project, but once that was out there, I thought, well, I mean, the book really serves to give a lot more explanation to who he was in his life than just that little snippet of, hey, he was crazy, he was on coke, and then he died, and here we are. So I think maybe some of those people who didn't want to tell their story in the beginning probably look back on it now and go, well, okay, well, he was legit. This really, because I know a lot of people too. I mean, there's tons of people like, I'm going to write a book, and they start and they never. I mean, for every one person that publishes a book, there's 100 or probably 1,000 that started it and bugged people and interviewed people, and people spent time that never happened. So I'm sure there's some people who probably just blew you off like, yeah, okay, I've had 100 people tell me they're going to do a Herb Abrams book. I'm not going to take the time. And then when yours came out, like, oh shit, this is really good. Maybe I should have took the time and talked to this guy,
Well, I hope so.
But to talk a little bit about the UWF in particular. So for me, I'm 45 years old. So in 1990, when the UWF came along, I was 13. Huge wrestling fan. Lived in North Mississippi, so I was limited to what I could see, what was actually airing in my neck of the woods. But I bought every wrestling magazine I could get my hands on, any book, anything wrestling related. I was all about it. So I was only able to follow the UWF and Herb Abrams' story in magazines up until I went to my aunt and uncle's over in Tennessee, and their video store had Beach Brawl, and I was able to rent Beach Brawl and watch it. And then eventually I got the VHS tapes. They're still sitting across the room from me right now. But to me, I'm pointing all that is at 13 years old, I was not able to discern between good wrestling and bad wrestling, and like it was all wrestling, and I liked it. And so what I was able to see, I liked it. Now when I go back, later on, and when I got older and I did tape trading and I got to watch a bulk of it, I got to notice like, I don't know, man. And then reading your book, and when you read those recaps consecutively, you're like, geez, they didn't have a clean finish in a main event almost the entire run. So when you were watching it back then, did you like it? Did you think it was good wrestling, or were you even then were you like, man, this is kind of rough? I'm going to follow this and see where it goes.
I was like you, and I had like all the magazines, read all the books from my library and stuff on it. And I'd been exposed to WWF, obviously, as everyone from my generation was, and WCW at that point. I mean, at the time when I was rewatching or when I was watching it for the first time, I never really thought to myself, oh, this is worse wrestling than what I'm seeing on the big two or something like that. Like, you don't notice that until I think until I got older and I started watching that. And at that point, when I started rewatching the UWF, the Monday Night Wars had already started and were pretty much over at that point. And you get so used to that sort of that ratings grab for Nitro and Raw, and how they always had to keep something going. Whereas during that time, if you watch like Wrestling Challenge from WWF, there were a lot of just sort of squash matches and a lot of matches that were very slow because, why would they want to work extremely hard, to put on a good match for something that isn't going to be, isn't going to factor in that much into the sort of grand spectacle or like the big picture of everything. But when I kind of rewatch it now, I kind of understand how slow it was, and especially how like the matches and everything, how you, like I said, like you were talking about before, like there were zero clean finishes for like much of it. And the one that I always think about was the blow-off match between Paul Orndorff and Steve Williams in a cage, which ended in a no contest, and they had how much interference in it too. And that was supposed to be like the blow-off match. That was their
Yeah,
last match, and nothing was settled at all. Because after that, Williams went on to be in the main event of the Beach Brawl, and Paul Orndorff had some make-believe feud with Colonel De Beers. Ended up on the Beach Brawl, which had
yeah,
nothing to do with anything. Um, yeah, so I mean, looking back now, it's different. At the time, though, it was like you, like I would watch anything, and I didn't really know the difference. I mean, I remember watching because I'm in Minnesota, so they had actually sort of at that point the AWA was pretty much over with, but there was a local affiliate that would show like the best of AWA, and it was often hosted by Vernon Greg Gagne or Nick Bockwinkel,
yeah.
and I watched that stuff. Like I taped that stuff off the television like all the time, would rewatch it. Now I try to watch, like I know this is sort of sacrilege because I'm from Minnesota, but now I try to rewatch some of that AWA, like those matches, and it's a trial for me.
Yeah.
So I just, at that time though, it's all good. It's all something that it's just pro wrestling, and you just want to get as much of it as humanly possible.
I will say though that even as a kid, those weird AWA green screen shows towards the end, even that struck me as like, this is weird. Like I don't, I don't know what this is. Like I don't know about this, but I still watched it. But even then, I was like, this is kind of different. But wrestling was at that time that the UWF came along, and me and my buddy Bob that recommended the book to me was talking about this recently, and actually, me and him have been so moved by this book and going back and watching UWF. We're fixing to start a podcast where we're going to go back and recap the UWF episodes. We're going to plug your book in every episode. We're going to plug it on our blog that's going to promote the podcast, and
Awesome.
so
Thank you.
because I'm sure it'll be a lot of help and a lot of the stuff that comes up. But
Hmm.
we're talking about in 1990. It was strange because if you look at the UWF and you look at the IWA that preceded it on Sports Channel,
Hmm.
if you looked at the WWF and you looked at NWA, WCW, yes, they had squash matches each week with maybe a somewhat of a main event, but everything was driving towards go out to the arena and buy a ticket, buy this pay per view next month. Everything had a reason, but like when you look at IWA and then UWF and then later like the AWF and the XWF and all these TV wrestling shows, until Beach Brawl come along over a year later, like none of this was driving towards anything. Like there wasn't house shows. There was a handful
Yeah,
scattered
there's
over
a few.
a
Yeah.
lifetime, but it's not like they were plugging them on the show. It's not like you ever saw and they're like coming this weekend. Later on down the line they did, but
Uh huh.
early on it just existed as a TV show. And we were talking about how that was kind of a weird time in wrestling because you had wrestling TV shows that only existed as a TV show. And if you take a step back and look at this, like, what motivates me to watch Dr. Death destroy Davey Meltzer and, Paul Orndorff wrestle the Black Knight week in and week out? Because the first several episodes are pretty repetitive. It's just the same mix of guys and
Uh
enhancement people just mixed around week in and week out.
huh.
Uh, it's very strange. It's just like, well, what was he hoping to do with this? Was it just a matter of being on TV? But I guess he was always driving towards that pay per view thing because in his mind, and as well documented in the book and everywhere else, from day one, Herb Abrams wanted to beat the WWF. I mean, he
Hmm.
wanted to compete with Vince McMahon from the first day he opened the door. Which is strange to me for somebody to think that was even an option, because you had WCW Crockett and all them had been around for years and they weren't
Hmm.
doing it at the
Yeah.
time. So, the people you interviewed, like, did talking to them, did they come into the UWF as like, hey, here's a guy he's going to pay me. It's work. Or
Hmm.
did any of them kind of share that vision of like, hey, we might can take on Vince. This might be everything this guy wants it to be. Or were they all pretty jaded, as most wrestlers are coming off? Because most of those guys had already had their run in WWF and were on the downward hill slide, if you will.
Yeah. I think for the most of it, especially the established wrestlers, I think it was just sort of like a payday because Abrams was paying very well for these wrestlers at the very beginning. Um, but um, yeah, I mean, I guess there were I guess there were a couple. I guess well, I guess I'll say this. I guess there were a couple there who thought it might get bigger, but I don't
Okay.
think any of them expected it to actually grow into something that could be, WWF. Um, especially when you kind of look back at it now and you see how ECW was very small and then they tried to grow into something, and it never really worked on like a nationwide level.
Yeah.
Um, UWF at that time, I think a lot of them were just there for the um, were just there for the paycheck because there were a lot of wrestlers who would cut promos about how they were here to stay and how they came here for the competition and everything, and then they would be gone like the next week. So they would get their paycheck and they would leave. Um, so I just sort of think it was that, but I think with like the guys like Steve Ray or Sonny Beach or Chris Michaels from the New York shows, I think they wanted to. For them, it was a way to kind of expose themselves to a larger audience. But as for like thinking that they were going to beat like Vince McMahon, I don't think anyone but Abrams thought that was possible.
Right. That makes sense. I tell you, the one person out of all this that I'm really shocked to this day that was involved in this is Bruno Sammartino. Like, I know he was on the outs with Vince at that point, but all the things that he criticized Vince for as he was on his way out the door uh, showed up pretty immediately in the UWF, and then especially all the shenanigans going on outside with
Yeah,
the drugs and the hookers and all this kind of stuff.
yeah.
Like, I'm surprised Bruno stuck around for as long as he did. Did anybody really have any insight for you into like what brought Bruno there and what kept Bruno there?
I got nothing off the top of my head. I think with Bruno, it was sort of like I think it was like I don't want to say it was just a paycheck because Bruno Sammartino I think was classier than that. That there would have to be some sort of other reason for him to come back on a show. Um, but I think too it was like being. I think Abrams was able to convince him because he was such a charming person, able to convince Bruno to come back. I'm sure Abrams really wanted that to see someone like Bruno Sammartino come back because he had been um, sort of ignored by WWF at that time. They never really acknowledged Bruno at that point.
Yeah.
So to bring him back, it was kind of I think it was kind of like an fu to the WWF that like you're going to get rid of these guys whom I thought were the biggest stars in the world when I was growing up, and I'm going to put them back on, and I'm going to get all this sort of army behind me of people who hate Vince and that were just you know uh, convinced that they were going to be able to just tackle Vince McMahon and bring him down. So I think that's kind of what it is. But as for like an exact reason why Bruno Sammartino came back on the television, I don't know because at that point he was doing some commentary for a women's league that never came that I don't think ever uh, came or never was never televised. I think he was doing some other commentary for another show. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was that might have come later, but it was around the same time. So I think he was open to working as a commentator. Um, and I think probably Abrams just probably gave him enough money. It was just very complimentary to him, and he finally just probably just went in. Probably just decided to come in. So when they brought him in.
One of the I guess unintentionally funny things for UWF, like through lines that goes almost through the entire promotion. Jimmy Kimmel used to have the bit where he would say Matt Damon was going to be on, then he got bumped every night, and that ran on for years. The constant advertising of Dan Spivey, who would then not be on there for months and years
Yeah.
at a time. It, I don't know. Me and my buddy Bob just always found that humorous, and I love that you made a point of mentioning that in the book and bringing that
Yeah.
up.
I have no idea. I don't know if like he actually thought like Dan Spivey was always going to be on the next show. I don't know, but yeah, that was true. Spivey was on the first show and was on the last show, and nothing in the middle. Because of how many weeks they shot in like um, as many weeks of television that they shot in one sort of sitting, they were able to get like a few episodes out of Dan Spivey. But like seriously, but he was only on there for two shows, the first and the last. So I don't know.
Oh, that's great. So, what do you think is the? I guess for most people's money, the only real thing that Herb pulled off that I'm sure got the attention of Vince McMahon or the WWF for at least a brief moment was having Andre the Giant on the show. And
Mhm.
even though it really didn't amount to anything, I mean, it was
Yeah.
just some bizarre appearances that he did, though.
Mhm.
Um, what did did anybody you talked to really think that maybe that legitimized him? They're like, well, this dude's got Andre the Giant. Something's going on here.
I don't think it was anything like. I mean, I guess there was it made some of the wrestlers just kind of like think like, oh, he had Andre the Giant on there, so he must be doing something right, and there must be something happening. But like you said, like it never went anywhere. He was only on that brief show, and then he did a couple of interview segments um, where he trashed Big John Studd. And Abrams had been trying to get Big John Studd to come in since 1990, since when he's got started. And he probably thought that once he got Andre in, that he would probably be able to cut these promos on Big John Studd and sort of tried to kind of trick him into coming in so they could do like a huge continuation of the nonstop feud between the two giants. But that was one of those things where I don't think it. I don't know if it. If anybody actually thought that it was going to be going to something, or if it was just going to be like because they would parade wrestlers, big time wrestlers in there all the time. There, one or two people in there that had big names, and you never see them again. Excuse me. And I think it was just. I think it was. I think for a lot of people, like it surprised them, but I don't think it surprised them enough to think like, this is gonna, bring us to the level of the, WCW or WWF at that time.
So I've been doing podcasts since 2007. So I've done a lot of these. I interviewed a lot of people for the book that never
Mm-hmm.
happened. So in all these interviews you did, and I'm going to give you an out because I'm going to mention the name of who I have in mind when I ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
But were there people who, as you were talking to him, in the back of your head, like this guy's completely full of shit? And the main one I'm thinking of, the guy who Doctor Death, the referee, I should point out,
Oh yeah,
who Doctor Death waylaid with the chair and then he no sold it. Like
yeah.
everything I read from him just seemed like just complete and utter crap. Like the way he told the story of the aftermath of that
Mm-hmm.
in the ring and all that. Like, how hard is it for you to just be like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, because I think the way he presented in the book, I mean, you didn't you quoted him and you put it out there, but I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
can kind of tell in reading it, you're like, yeah,
Yeah,
okay, here's his version. I'm sure this is exactly what it went.
yeah. Because I contrasted the Brandon Pender, who's the referee, his memory of it with Bill Anderson and a couple of the other wrestlers who were there at the time, so they kind of gave their sort of memory of it. Um, I think with Brandon Pender, I look back there, I wonder because like I'm not the most, I don't know, like I'm not the best interviewer of all time or anything. So in those cases when you're hearing something like that and you kind of know that that's not true, or like the stuff that he talks about how they were gonna have like a mini feud or something later on,
Yeah.
and you're like, yeah, I don't think that they would have bothered with that at all. But it's one of those things where it's like at that moment you say, "Well, I don't think this ever happened," and then you sort of get the interviewee sort of angry, or do you kind of do you just let them go on and see,
Yeah,
and then dig through all the details that they have later on. I don't know, but I mean, I guess there were a couple times when I heard stuff from people. It didn't happen much, but there were a couple times when I thought I sort of knew the information was wrong, and it wasn't just like their like bad memory, or it was just because it was so long ago that they might have been starting to make some of that stuff up just to make them save face in a couple of
right.
situations. So yeah, I mean that. Do I believe everything? I mean that the referee said. Well, obviously not. But I, you know, but I like there might have been. I mean, how he got started and stuff with the UWF and stuff like that. I don't see like that. There was any reason for him to sort of lie about that. But it was all the parts about how with the Steve Williams situation that you kind of think to yourself like, this probably didn't really happen.
It definitely felt like a saving face situation. Anybody that knows anything about wrestling or has been on the inside of it, because my thoughts, because I mean, I'm still involved in wrestling now. I manage and do commentary. I used to wrestle for years. And my first thought when I saw that, because I saw that a long time ago and it didn't really register with me. And then several years ago, after I'd got in the business, I was watching, I guess, the steel cage match or the lumberjack VHS.
Mhm.
And in the highlights, they showed that. And I
Yeah.
was like, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't pay attention this the first time. And I rewound it and watched it like 3 times. And I'm like, okay, first of all, why in the world did they put this in a highlight montage to
Yeah.
set up this match? Like, you would think they'd want to bury this under everything. And it's like, number two, like, I mean, I don't know Steve Williams, but I knew a lot of people that knew him. And it's
Mhm.
like watching that, I'm like, I can't believe he didn't go back there and literally just beat that dude half to death. And so I can only imagine the kind of crap that guy got for that for years. Like, oh my,
Uh-huh.
you know, sold Dr. Death and live to tell about it. Cool, man. Like, but I'm sure in his head over the years, like he's probably told that story enough and reshaped it to by the
Mhm.
time he got around telling you, that's just the version he tells now. And I'm sure in his
Yeah.
head, like, yeah, man, if they would have made an angle out of that, we could have
Mhm.
drew some money. And oh yeah,
Yeah.
the referee that no soul, even though like you
Uh-huh.
pointed out, and Paul Orndorff's selling it like death, down
Mhm.
there from taking one chair shot. This referee took four and just never left his feet.
I somehow think too that those Steve Williams was holding back from kind of killing the guy, because if you were going to hit that guy 4 times with a steel chair from Steve Williams, you'd probably be
Oh
I'd probably be in the hospital by then. So he's probably able to kind of hold back a little bit, I think, and which was probably the best for that guy. And also, he probably didn't want something horrible to happen, like on film, and then have to
yeah,
go to get sued or something for
yeah,
that. But backstage, he was ready to kill him. He was ready to kill him.
yeah, yeah. I'm sure in the back of his mind, he's picturing like, okay, they'll play this footage for the jury at this at his murder trial if I do what I want to do right now. So,
You're right. Yeah.
one of the fun things I thought that like right out of the chute is Herb got right to it with the merchandise. Like NWA, WCW, it took them years to finally start peddling some T-shirts and videos
Mhm.
and different things. And so in the first couple episodes, boom, right out of the gate, we've got a Dan Spivey T-shirt, which is fun, and then you got the
Yeah.
Paul Orndorff shirt, who looks a lot like Lex Luger, somewhat there.
Yeah.
And the B. Brian Blair shirt and those awful looking hats and things like that. And it's like you could just tell watching those first couple episodes, like, yeah, this guy is trying to go big.
Mhm.
900 numbers were all the rage back then. He jumped right into the old 900 number game pretty
Uh-huh.
early on there. But my big question for you I have is, if you could go back in time, if you had a time machine and you could go back and only try one flavor of UWF cookies, which one would you choose?
Well, I think it would have to be oatmeal, because I think they were all oatmeal in some way or another. except for the B. Brian Blair one, which might have been still, it was honey flavored, but might have been oatmeal honey too. Only one, I don't know how I'd be able to choose. I
Well,
would,
it's got to be the Herbie cookie, right? I mean, I'm sure
oh,
that's what everybody was
that's a good
clamoring
point.
for.
Yeah, that's a good
Coming
point.
soon, the Herbie cookie. Like,
Well,
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, it was so funny because, I mean, he, yeah, you could tell he wanted to bring back some old school and all that, but man, he wanted to be the star of the show so bad.
Mhm. Oh
And
yeah,
over time, it became more and more evident, you know.
yeah, yeah. Especially towards the end there, the those shows in South Carolina with Jimmy Valiant and everything, where he was sort of the sort of the main character of the feud, even though he wasn't, he wasn't a wrestler. And they're, what were they going to do with that with Colonel Red? Um, but yeah, that's the one where he on those South Carolina matches on those shows. That's when he got he bladed, and it's kind of obvious when you watch it on the television show now.
Yeah.
I didn't see that when I was young. I didn't know how they did that and everything. But then he's bleeding all over, and they take him in a stretcher, and they just it's like they didn't like cut that into parts either. It's like the whole the whole thing of the doctors putting him on there and then wheeling him out and everything. And then of course at the end after that, they were like, here are some comments by Herb Abrams, and he's just this bloody mess with his shirt ripped, and he's just so disheveled. But he's like, I'm gonna get you, Colonel Red. No matter what I have to do, I'm gonna get you. And of course that wouldn't no place. But at the same time, he, I mean, I think part of it was that he wanted the UWF to be a platform to make him famous,
Oh, yeah.
be someone that would be recognizable like a Vince McMahon on television. Um, yeah, so I think that's why he put himself up there all the time in front of the camera. Yeah, so he definitely wanted to be the star of that show.
And for younger people watching this who don't necessarily understand the context, you got to realize that even in 91 and 2, when by the time we're getting to what we're talking about now, and in like 92
Mhm.
and 3, this is pre Mr. McMahon. This is pre
You
Vince McMahon was still just, as far as anybody knew, as an announcer on WWF. Like, I can't say I had ever really seen, unless you count Lawler in Memphis, but people didn't know he was the owner and
Mhm.
promoter. I've never seen a promoter cut a fiery babyface promo while blood running down their
Yeah.
head. I mean, it was, and I've heard Brian Blair say in multiple interviews that that's one of the moments where he tried to kind of put his foot down. I was like, "Herb, this is not good." And he's
Yeah.
like, but my checks were still clearing. So, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Just let him do it. Yeah, like you said, just the checks were clearing, so why rock the boat?
And it was always fun to me that Captain Lou Albano was involved. I love that you kind of covered some of his fun commentary that happened a little later on. Some of the most
I, I
nonsensical stuff.
I think that's one of the highlights of the UWF. I heard people like in reviews of like the shows groan and talk about how it was so embarrassing or whatever, and I just thought so much, especially that one at the War Memorial, the Florida show after the Beach Brawl, when he's just going off on everything. And he's talking about how like he's talking about how awful like the Super Ninja and Madman Pondo and like these guys have like these great physiques and they're really flabby or whatever. To me, that's one of the best parts of the UWF history was just Captain Lou just being able to get an open mic and just go nuts with everything he was thinking.
And what's funny is like you say, people groan about it and people knocked it, but like if you go back to like the rock and wrestling Captain Lou's heyday, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, when he did get a hold of a mic and they gave him the opportunity, I mean, he said a lot of just off the wall, crazy, nonsensical stuff. Like you really can't point to a great Captain Lou promo or a Captain Lou promo that really made a lot of sense or whatever. As it's kind of his whole thing. He just says, but it was in small doses. It was a little segment of Captain Lou that we moved on. And when you have him on the mic commentating through an entire episode, I
Uh-huh.
remember watching it later on in life. I'm like, as soon as they said, "Oh, standing, sitting in for Bruno San Martino, Captain Lou Albano," I thought, "Oh my God, this is going to be entertaining in one form or another." And like you said, them them roasting Pondo. And I know Pondo somewhat. I've had him on my podcast in the past to promote his book, and I didn't think to ask him about the UWF. But once we get this
Mhm.
UWF podcast going, I'm going to reach out and have him on because, I mean, for him, that would have been one of the first times in his career that he made it on a nationwide wrestling show. And I can only imagine what it felt like to
Mhm.
watch that back and hear that commentary, not to mention the story like you covered in the book, talking to him
Mhm.
about how it played out in the dressing room after the
Yeah.
fact and all that. I know that it had to be just heartbreaking because even like they didn't cut him any slack at all. It was
No,
rough.
no.
Nor did he deserve any because that was, oh my gosh, that was
That
a
was a pretty poor match. Yeah, you could tell that they were both very, very green at that time, and they probably at that point in their careers, or especially Super Ninja, because I don't think he ever went on to do anything else.
yeah,
But with Madman Pondo and everything, I think that was pretty early in his career. He
yeah.
probably shouldn't have been on TV yet. That was probably sort of a do a match in front of the trainers or whatever point in his career.
But that also to go back to something we were just talking about, that the fact the Pondo match made air, the fact that Dr. Death hitting the referee multiple
Mm-hmm.
times that he didn't sell it made a montage to promote a big blow off match just
Yeah.
showed how inexperienced like the production side of things was. And that was one of the fascinating things in your book, hearing how thrown together, I mean, how you had college kids
Mm-hmm.
coming out who's probably never seen a wrestling show, some of them, and now they're shooting a
Uh-huh.
wrestling show and struggling to get paid and all that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just crazy to me that over time you've sunk this much money into this wrestling promotion and you've got big stars like Paul Orndorff there, and then you're just throwing together a shoestring budget of college kids to actually film it to put it on TV.
Yeah. He was never. I don't think he ever put the production people on the same level of the wrestlers. I think he always thought that he had to keep the wrestlers around, but the production people he always thought that they were just going to they were just going to do their job, and then he could um you know you not pay them or whatever. So I I so that was the thing though. So you look back on that sort of the production of it. The first few episodes in California were okay, and then the New York shows as they progressed, I think they got a little worse. And then by the time you got to South Carolina or North Dakota, those shows, you can tell that he wasn't playing the money in, that he was
Yeah.
playing into the wrestlers.
Yeah, it looks like some bad indie stuff by the time you got to the
Yeah.
Carolinas, Dakota. Um, and then you had pretty awesome production at the MGM Grand. You just didn't have any fans.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, for old time's sake, it's the last show, so we had to get one more nonsensical. We get a double count out in a lumberjack match with Cactus Jack,
Yeah.
and that was one of my favorite stories from Mick Foley's first book.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what renewed my interest in. I had seen UWF when I was a kid and followed the magazine, saw some VHS, kind of forgot about it, and then I read Foley's book and heard some of his stories, and that's the first kind of behind the scenes things I ever heard about Herb Abram. Like I'd read in the magazines and they would kind of touch on it, but not
Hmm.
really. And that's kind of the first time that I really started hearing like some of the craziness and the people not getting paid and the drugs and all this sort of
Yeah.
thing, and made me start getting and googling and digging in and start trying to find some of this stuff out. But
Hmm.
like you said, steel cage match ends in a disqualification. A
Yeah.
lumberjack match ends in a double count out, just painful. And I was noticing as I was going through some things like on that MGM Grand show, there was what 12, 14 matches, whatever it was. Two matches on that entire card weren't a title match. There was
Yeah.
Cactus and Snuka, and then the Finnish Warlord or whatever they called him, the Finnish Warrior or whatever. That was a non-title match. Every other match up and down the card was a championship match. There was a midget title. There's a women title. There's an MGN Grand title, TV title, America's title. Like
Yeah.
all these belts had appeared out of nowhere, and then that's the last. That's the last show.
I mean, I don't know. I kind of wonder what would have happened had he kept going to another show. I mean, and he had like 12 belts or whatever. I mean, he probably thought that the title matches are usually the most exciting. So I thought, well, if we can put on two, we can put on 11 or 10 or 12 or whatever. So I think it. I thought I guess he didn't quite understand that, like, the reason why the title matches are so captivating because there's not a lot of them on television or whatever, but he just went the opposite direction, just decided to
Yeah.
put them all on.
How can we not pack the MGM Grand if every match is a title match? I mean, and,
That's
and
right.
sadly, that's not even all the titles that he had. Like different times, there had been
Hmm.
the intercon. He had a random intercontinental
Yeah,
title. He had an Israeli title.
yeah, yeah. The Intercontinental title only showed up at the North Dakota shows for Bob Orton, and then there's the Southern Heavyweight Championship, I think too, which was um, which showed up for like one show between Bob Orton, Paul Orndorff, and
Yeah.
South Carolina. I mean, I don't know. It's fun to look back now and see all that stuff.
So, is there anything that since you completed the book and it's out there that you've learned since or came out afterwards, you're like, oh man, I wish I could have got that into the book, but I found out too late.
Um, yeah, I mean, I was his best friend contacted me, and this was after the book came out, and we were sort of talking a little bit uh, through just Facebook or whatever, and he was wondering why he never like got interviewed, and I was like, because yeah, your name never came up. I had no idea who you were or whatever. And so I put together. It hasn't been published yet because we're still waiting for some of the pictures. But it's turned into an article for SlamWrestling.net. But on that, in terms of some of the stuff that I wish I could have put in, I wish I could have put in the exact information of like which stores he owned and what they sold, stuff like that. I
Yeah.
in the book, it's kind of like, well, he owns stores, but we don't know exactly. And I think I quote someone who thinks there was like 10 or 11 or something, but there really wasn't. There's like four.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that came to mind that I wish I could have put in. Uh, and then just sort of the reflections on, from his best friend. At the same time, too, I had family members of his contact me who I didn't talk to because I just didn't know who they were or whatever. And I wish I would have been able to get those interviews. I don't know. I mean, there probably would have been new information in there, but I don't know what. But
Yeah.
I wish I would have been able to talk to them. And then there was the best friend, and I'm still trying to contact people and interview them because in my mind, I'm thinking like there's got to be a 10th anniversary edition where I get to update the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that's sort of in my mind what I'm doing is trying to get some of that information that I didn't get in there and maybe post it on the Facebook group and then also hold it for the hopefully the sort of the anniversary edition.
Awesome. As we wrap up, I want to ask and you may have an exact number, I don't know, but just a guesstimate. How many hours of time went in to make this book on your part?
I have no idea because it's like I tell people a lot about how it took like 10 years or 11 years to get the whole thing together. But there were a couple years in there where like I was having sort of personal issues and stuff, and I really didn't focus on the book like at all.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of like going through the research and typing everything out and then getting the outline and then having to go through and find out where to use quotes and try to make sure that you didn't use the same quote twice or whatever. I know when I'm going through the book, I noticed that there were a couple times when I put down the same sort of information twice from maybe like a few pages back and then again.
Yeah.
I wish I would have been able to kind of change that, but I mean, it was just countless hours. Like I could never even begin to, know how much time I spent just like especially watching like every episode of the UWF I could get. I watched every episode. Well, I'd seen a bunch of them before that, but I watched every episode again, and then I watched it again after that to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Right.
So I mean, just that alone, I have no idea how long that took, and I'm still going back to episodes, making sure I got everything right even after that. So honestly, I have no idea, not even a ballpark.
And it's probably best that way. It probably hurt your feelings if you really broke down exactly how, like, oh my, this is how much of my
What
life I
else could I
dedicated
have
to
done with my life, right?
this. Well, I for one, and I know my friend Bob would agree that it was a job well done, and we're glad you did it. And I know there's a lot of other people that do as well. And so, speaking of, folks, go and join the Facebook group, facebook.com/UWF Herb Abrams book.
Hmm.
You can go there and like that page and follow along. And I'm sure there's links there to purchase the book. Um,
Yeah, I think so, but it's mostly just on Amazon. I think if you go
yeah,
to
you can go
Amazon
on
and type in,
Amazon.
that's I think primarily the place where you can probably just get it. So,
If you can search on Amazon, if not, this is where our new podcast is going to be. It's going to be called. You find the little graphic that we made there. The UWF Fury Cast, the Herb Abrams UWF podcast. If you go
I
to
love it.
tinyurl.com/UWF podcast, at the very top right hand corner, there is an Amazon link. You click on that link, you can buy Jonathan's book,
Thank you.
and it's highly recommended. We're going to be referencing it each week on this show. And so what we're planning to do, Bob has his doubts that we can pull it off, but we're going to each watch, starting at episode 1, every episode that's available, all the VHS releases and the pay-per-view.
Hmm.
Each week we're going to watch, starting number 1, watch that episode. We're going to talk about the episode, a little of the behind the scenes stuff, kind of give some context of like, hey, Paul Orndorff was fresh off his run in WCW here
Hmm.
as one of the dudes with attitudes, that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
we're going to try to run through the entire run of UWF. Will we make it? I don't know, but we're going to do our best. We're going to reach out to some people, try to get them on the show to do some interviews. Would
Sounds
love to
great.
have you back on from time to time to
Love to.
give some insight and update us on how things are coming along with the 10th anniversary book. 10th anniversary edition of the book is what I'm trying to say. I hadn't had a lot of sleep in the last few days.
But
But man, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. And again, awesome job on the book, man.
yeah, thank you. I had a lot of fun today. Thank you for inviting me on, and I can't wait to hear your podcast about the UWF. I already looking forward to it.
All right. Well, we're hoping to start it out next weekend. This episode is going to drop this coming Wednesday. I'll send you the link when it comes out, and every Wednesday after that, we'll drop the podcast. So we're gonna relive the UWF, and you help spark that. So
Yeah,
you can either take the blame or
or take
or
the
be
credit.
proud, whichever.
Yeah,
Take credit or take the blame, however you want to
yeah,
look
that's
at it.
right.
But thank you, Jonathan. Good luck, and
Thank
again,
you.
everybody, please go check out his book. It's really good. It's available in paperback, and you can do it like me, get it on Kindle. And I was able to read it during my slow season at work. I burned through that book pretty quick, and we'll be rereading it again each week because you have some really great episode recaps in there, and make sure I don't miss anything.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
All right, take care, man, and we'll talk
Yeah.
to you soon.
See ya.
All right. Fun episode. Like I said, I've been looking forward to that. And Jonathan came through just like I knew he would. And it was a lot of fun. And again, check us out, the Fury Cast, the Herb Abrams UWF podcast. And you can go now. We've got a page up, tinyurl.com/UWF podcast. We're going to be posting each episode there where you can watch it. And then you can watch us discuss it. And we'll be putting up clips. And me and Bob each week will be suggesting a YouTube video of a good match, as we're going to call it, to kind of cleanse your palate after sitting through an episode of UWF. I don't know. Maybe you love UWF, maybe you don't, but we're going to have some fun. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again with another episode of the Jackson Interaction Podcast real soon.